and welcome to the Georgetown Urban Health Collaborative Spring Speaker Series. I'm Bernard Liese, the chair of the Department of International Health here at Georgetown, and I would also like to introduce my colleague Rebecca Gribble, who you see standing and waving there. Together we run the Georgetown Urban Health Collaborative, which aims to employ social epidemiology to address health challenges in urban environments here in the US and internationally. Today, we are extremely pleased to welcome Leila McCay, who we know well because she taught for us quite a while ago, and who will speak today about designing cities for mental health. So let me say a couple of words about Leila. Leila is the director of the Center for Urban Design and Mental Health, and is also the director of policy at the UK's National Health Service Confederation. Leila is a psychiatrist by training, so she knows what she's talking about. And she has a background in international public health and health systems. She set up the Center for Urban Design and Mental Health in 2015 to help increase interest and knowledge sharing and translational research to improve population mental health through smart urban design. Trained at Maudsley Hospital Institute of Psychiatry in London, Leila has a very keen interest in the determinants of mental health and a passion, I would say, for the built environment and helping people love the places they live in, because that's very important. We really need to feel comfortable and protected by the places we live in. Leila, pleasure to see you. You're welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to speak probably for about 45 minutes, and please do pop your questions into the chat box, and then we can have a conversation afterwards. But yeah, as Professor Lisa said, I set up UDMH, the Centre for Urban Design and Mental Health, just over 5 years ago, kind of by chance while I was working at Georgetown University. At the time, I was working in global health, but I was also a psychiatrist, and I did have a particular interest in cities, but I hadn't really put two and two together until one of my students during a global mental health class raised their hand and said, "Hey, Professor, I've read all about how cities can be planned and designed to improve physical health, like, to reduce obesity or to reduce lung diseases. But what about mental health? Can you actually design cities that improve your mental health?" And I was completely fascinated by that question. How do you design a city to improve mental health? Could you? I didn't know anything about it, which was awkward. So I told them we'd discuss it in the next class. And then I went away and I did some research. And what I learned was that there had been lots of focus on physical health. Just like that student said, there were guidelines everywhere, guidelines in cities all over the world, lots of scientific papers, but there was very, very little on mental health. So I dug further into the literature, and I didn't find a huge amount, but of course there was some, and I got in touch with some of the researchers, and they told me pretty much the same thing. There is huge potential to improve mental health at population level and at individual level through city design, but it wasn't really happening. Now, don't get me wrong, obviously architects and planners have always wanted to make places a nice experience for people. There's tons of interest in how to make things more beautiful or nicer to live in, but there was significantly less about making it good for mental health, which means, all of that effort to beautify a place and make it nice was in the remit of architects and planners, but it wasn't falling within the sphere of public health, which was a massive loss. The researchers told me that it should be there because designing places can go much further than just making somebody feel happy in a moment. It can actually have this impact on health, and that should be exploited. So I asked them, why is this not huge? And they speculated it had a lot to do with lack of knowledge. There wasn't a ton of research, not that many people knew how to design a city for good mental health. And, you know, maybe stigma was at play. For physical health, there's quite often people advocating for design this city to reduce obesity or such like. Whereas when it comes to mental health, there was a lot of anxiety at the time, even perhaps still to this day, about if you focused really strongly on mental health, would people speculate about your own mental health? And, you know, that seemed to be an issue that is quite pervasive around the world. And this has created a bit of a vicious circle because there wasn't enough research to make a really compelling case for why and how urban design should be used to improve mental health. But because it wasn't a topic that people were interested in talking about and investing in, so there wasn't actually enough funding to get good research done. There wasn't enough interest to publish it in the public domain. So the knowledge wasn't being created and it wasn't reaching the ears of architects and planners and designers and, you know, the people who commission these people. So the topic continued to be overlooked. And this really matters. There's a UN estimate that by 2050, 69% of the world's population are going to live in cities. And the research tells us that city dwellers are much more likely to develop mental disorders than people who don't live in cities. And it's not just a matter of the individual impact. Depression is the biggest driver of worldwide disability. And the global economic cost is huge. It's predicted to reach about $16 trillion by 2030. We know that public mental health is a key part of achieving a thriving, resilient city, which is, you know, the jargon that we always hear is incredibly important. There's a lot of investment, there's a lot of interest. But the urban design for mental health aspects was being almost ignored. So I asked the researchers who'd worked on this what would help to grow the field. And they said a legitimate organisation that focused on the nexus of urban design and mental health could help to turn it into a recognised public health field that people could really get behind, and they would invest in it, and people who were interested in it would have a platform to get together and collaborate and publish and amplify each other's work. And I realised there was nothing to stop me from setting it up. So I did, and I brought together some of the students from my global mental health class to become our first interns and help to set up the centre as a new international virtual think tank. These 4 students co-wrote a research review that turned into a book chapter that has pretty much defined the field for the past 5 years. They helped us launch it at a glamorous launch party at the British Embassy. And, you know, they got really interested in it. One of the students who was working on it at the time is now doing a PhD on a related topic. So we developed it into a proper think tank with a journal, which people from Georgetown have published in recently. We've run all sorts of events, not just in Washington, but in London, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. You can watch all the videos on our urban design and mentalhealth.com website. And it's just been really interesting to bring together the researchers and the architects and the planners and the people who commission these architects and planners and city makers of all sorts to have these conversations together. And the impact has been quite significant. Now urban design for mental health has been recognised by the UN, by the World Health Organization, by city mayors all over the world. There's lots of understanding about how to leverage this nexus of urban design and mental health. And the guidelines and frameworks that we've developed are being used in all sorts of cities, which is fantastic. And it's really great to see the research growing, more organizations starting up. And essentially, this is becoming almost mainstream. But don't worry, there is still a huge amount more to research in this. So if it's an area that you're interested in, there is tons of scope, and it's going to be a really exciting area. And I'm telling you all of this to help explain the background to urban design and mental health. I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture telling you a bit about the frameworks we've developed and giving you a preview, the first worldwide preview of the contents of the book that I've been writing with one of the UDMH fellows, which is going to be published in August by Bloomsbury, Obviously, that is very exciting because that's the same publisher as Harry Potter, and I am very confident we're going to have approximately the same level of sales and enthusiasm. So let's just start off by talking about mental health. I'm sure that almost everyone in this audience has at least a passing understanding of mental health, but let's make sure that we're all on the same page and talk definitions. So according to the World Health Organization, mental health is a state where a person can realize their own potential, cope with normal stresses of life, work productively, and is able to make a contribution to their community. People who have mental disorders, they experience some combination of problems with their thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and their relationships with other people. And these are symptoms that cause distress and impair their ability to function and meet that definition of mental health. And of course, types of disorders might include depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, dementia, ADHD, schizophrenia, all sorts of things. And promoting mental health and supporting people who've got mental health disorders isn't just about medication or therapy. We're talking here about a public health approach through urban planning and design, which that needs to really focus on maximizing all the different things within the city that can promote well-being. So you're probably thinking, why is it that cities affect mental health so much? What's that all about? And nobody has the exact answer to that. In my opinion, there are four main mechanisms. One is that people who move to the city are actually predisposed to developing mental health problems. They quite often have pre-existing risk factors. So, for example, if people move to the city in search of a job, that might mean that they've had employment problems, and unemployment is a risk factor for lots of mental disorders. People might move because they are seeking asylum from another country, or moving away from something that put them at risk in their original home place. And those things, again, put you at increased risk of developing mental health problems. Homelessness, physical health problems, mental health problems, family breakup, addiction, all things that both bring you to the city and predispose you to developing mental health problems. So that's the first thing, pre-existing risk factors. Then we've got social factors, which is that people who have all of those risk factors that I just described can often encounter negative disparities in the city. So if you don't have much money, you might end up in neighborhoods that are quite challenging and have aspects of them that actually put your mental health at more risk. Then we've got overload. So people who live in a city get a huge amount of stimulation from density, crowding, noise, smells, lights, adverts, pollution. There's an intense amount of input going into you. And, you know, every part of the urban environment is designed to make you think or feel or act in a certain way. And all of that can come together to increase the body's baseline level of stress and arousal in terms of, if you think of the fight and flight response, it can hold you up there in that fight response for so long that it can be quite exhausting. And it makes you want to essentially retreat a little bit, go into yourself, not necessarily engage as much socially as you might have done otherwise. The fourth factor, and probably my favorite factor in the context of you can do a lot about this through urban design, is the loss of protective factors. So there's lots of things about your environment that are good for your mental health. It protects your mental health. And being in the city sometimes reduces your exposure to them. So a good example is access to nature, or the amount of leisure time you have because you're spending so much time at work or commuting. People can feel less safe, they can have less privacy, they can have less sleep because it's noisy or overcrowded, all sorts of things. So how do you design a city to counteract those? I told you that the 4 Georgetown students who did the review sort of set the scene for how to define this from their original literature search. And we've brought it all together into something called Mind the Gaps, We call that framework Mind the Gaps for 3 reasons. First, Mind the Gap is such a famous catchphrase of the London Underground, so it's personally appealing. Second, it reminds architects and city planners that there's actually a gap in their plan that needs to be filled in, and that gap is thinking about the mental health impact. And of course, it is a mnemonic as well. GAPS stands for green space, active space, pro-social space, and safe space. So just to tell you mildly a little bit more about these, the G, green space, is access to nature. It's the urban design intervention with the most evidence behind it for improving mental health. We know that exposure to natural environments can reduce depression and stress and help to manage symptoms of quite a lot of other disorders like anxiety, schizophrenia, ADHD, dementia. Research tells us that nature exposure in childhood reduces the risk of developing mental illness in adulthood. So it obviously makes sense that design approaches should focus on maximizing good quality green space. The A in Mind the Gaps is active space. And research tells us that physical activity can be as effective as antidepressants for mild to moderate depression, as well as helping with stress regulation and supporting brain function. So cities are often designed to increase physical activity with a view to improving physical health. But actually, the co-benefits for mental health are really valuable. Then we've got the P, pro-social space. So that's space that positively encourages positive social interactions. We know that that reduces people's risk of developing depression, anxiety, dementia, and suicidal thoughts. And it improves people's self-esteem and feelings of belongingness. Finally, the S is safe space. And a sense of safety and security is absolutely integral to people's mental health and well-being. Whether that is safety from crime, from traffic, from pollution, or safety from getting lost when you've got dementia and you're trying to find your way home. That's the framework that has been used for the past 5 years. And it's been integrated into design and planning all over the world. But, in the past 5 years, there has been a lot of research done. So we thought it was probably time to update things and bring in all this new knowledge that has been developed over the last few years. And along with another UDMH fellow, Jenny Rowe, I have been working over the past couple of years on expanding the framework to write the definitive book on the topic of urban design for mental health. I didn't come up with a snappy acronym for this one, disappointingly. It's called the Restorative City. You are the first audience who gets to hear about it, which is very exciting. The book itself is going to be published on the 12th of August. So I am in the middle of proofreading horror at the moment, but it is going well and I'm really excited about it. So we're calling it the Restorative Cities because restorative environments are settings that help to regulate our emotions and help us recover from mental fatigue, stress, and demands of everyday life. So it feels like quite a good summary of what urban design and planning for mental health is trying to do. So if we could go on to the next slide, which is the green city. You'll see some parallels here. This one's obviously the G from Mind the Gaps. And that's because, of all the interventions you can do in the urban environment to improve mental health, green space just has such strong levels of evidence. It's always been understood that green space was good for your mental health, even before, people started to do formal research on it. People were putting city parks in for people's well-being long before anybody did a randomized controlled trial of the subject. And, even if you think of over the last few months during the COVID pandemic, we have seen people gravitating to parks for their daily walks because inherently they know that it makes them feel a bit better than walking in some other places. Research tells us that mental health's improved when you're surrounded by greenery, but there's even an effect if you just see it across the street or out your office window. Even looking at a picture of natural things has some effect. But how does it actually work? I'm afraid we're back into speculation. There's 3 big theories about how it would work psychologically. Attention restoration theory. Essentially, it says that looking at nature is applying your brain to observing complexity. that holds your attention, but without requiring mental effort. It just evokes curiosity and wonder. If you compare it to like looking at some bright advert or looking at a traffic light, these things demand your attention and your interpretation. But when you're looking at nature, it just sort of enables your brain to look at it, pay attention, but also be relaxed at the same time. Second theory is stress reduction theory, and that's about the benefit that comes from our emotional response to nature. And, you know, the idea is it triggers your parasympathetic nervous system, which induces calm. The third theory, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, is biophilia. And that one is all about how humans biologically have an innate need to connect with the natural world, all, you know, going back to evolution, which is inherently associated with lower stress levels than more urban environments. So there's other reasons too, as you might imagine. Green spaces like parks are a really good setting for physical activity, for social interaction. And greenery in a city can also help people sleep through different mechanisms like urban cooling or masking of noise pollution. And, you know, we know that lots of cities prioritize green space already. And when we think, but we're thinking about it from a mental health perspective, really what everyone wants to know is, what's the dose of green space? What are the parameters? And we do know that quality and proximity are the key features here. People need to be able to access nice, well-maintained green space on a daily basis. It has to feel safe and pleasant. Sort of unkempt spaces that feel a bit dangerous are actually not going to have that effect. But there's all sorts of interesting opportunities. Let's have the next slide. So, of course, the next one is the blue city, which is really interesting. We've split it out. Back in the day, we were thinking of nature, but there's green and there's blue because actually there's just become a lot of emerging research on the impact of water in its various forms on mental health. And, you know, that's not a great surprise. I think that people intuitively feel that water can contribute to making us feel calm and relaxed. And for many a year, poets and artists would be able to tell you that green space was, you know, that blue space was something that touches us and soothes us, whether it's waves or a river or a fountain. We play in it, we swim in it, we're transported, we watch it. Essentially, the potential healing power of water has been harnessed for centuries. Think of the thoracic therapies of ancient Egypt or Italy and Greece, or, you know, in the 19th century, sea bathing for melancholy, taking in the sea air, perceived as, you know, a rejuvenation treatment, all sorts of spas around the world. And it's only now that the rigorous research is actually trying to understand it more specifically within mental health. And it's being called blue health. The studies are telling us what we've all sort of suspected. Water can be used to help reduce depression, reduce stress, and improve mood. But do be aware, it's still a pretty new area of research. So that evidence is still emerging. And the benefits are thought to work in a pretty similar way to green space. So those psychological effects of attention restoration, stress reduction, and biophilia, coupled with the cooling effects, which are even more impactful when it comes to water than nature. It's also worth being aware that, you know, opportunities to walk, cycle, play, socialize by water can all have beneficial effects on mental health. But if your water in question looks polluted or smells horrible or is generally unattractive, then these benefits are lost. But the emerging research is essentially telling us there's real opportunity here for cities that have coastlines, lakes, rivers, even ponds, to try to harness those for mental health, and also to think about climate adaptation approaches and how, while using water to manage various aspects to do with climate, you can harness those to also leverage benefits for mental health. Next slide. So the next pillar of restorative cities is really where the evidence is only just emerging, even though people kind of feel intuitively like they know that there's evidence for it. There's not as much as you might think. but it's the sensory city. So that is looking at the impact of all 5 senses plus a 6th, which is ambience. There's all sorts of theories about senses and mental health, like, you know, a certain color will make you feel a certain way, but there's not been tons of compelling evidence about whether those are just subjective, fleeting effects or whether they are actually going to have a longer term impact on your mental health. So we've done a rigorous search of all the literature to try and understand what the truth is. And we found lots of interesting things. So there's this interesting idea that cities prioritize sight and maybe sound in design above all the other senses. And the concept is that from the perspective of evolutionary psychology, this is pretty incongruous. If our ancestors once came from the savannah, then they were used to using all their senses at once, whereas by focusing on only specific senses, then people feel kind of limited. I've seen it described as a psychological fracture. But the idea is that engaging all the senses could help to resolve that and make us feel more connected to people and place. There's also an interesting idea that when it comes to thinking about designing cities for senses, people who run cities mostly hear about the problems. So, you know, an annoying noise, an unpleasant smell. So their effort is spent in mitigating problems rather than designing things proactively to harness things for good. From an urban design perspective, that leads us to 2 objectives: increasing the design that can promote mental health through the senses. There's lots of interesting opportunities like sonic refuges, hearing comforting sounds and smells like children laughing and freshly baked bread, lighting design that helps people feel safe at night, visually interesting open storefronts instead of these big monotonous featureless walls of a superstore that take up the whole block. Even convenient access to different fresh foods. That takes me back to the photo that I've included in the sensory city, which you can see is a train station in Japan. And the reason I've included that is that they're experimenting with blue lighting as a way of deterring people from committing suicide. It's not clear why seeing blue light would make you less likely to want to try and commit suicide, but some say the colour is calming. Some say it reminds people of the police. Some say it just disrupts the expected visual field, which creates a distraction in your brain. It's not quite clear the size of the impact, but it's an area that's getting a lot of interest in research at the moment. Conversely, of course, there's the opportunity to just get rid of unpleasant noises and smells, although remembering that these things are subjective. All right, let's go on to the next slide, and the 4th pillar, which is the neighborly city. And I'm surprised that the publishers let me call it the neighborly city, because you Americans are all probably upset by that "you" within the spelling of it. But anyway, this is essentially a reworking of the pro-social part of Mind the Gaps, but it's more complex because this is a rapidly growing research area. I mean, it's not news that if you have strong networks of supportive social relationships, you're less likely to develop mental health problems and recover from them. And it's also not news that social isolation and loneliness are going to increase your risk of mental health problems. Studies are telling us that at least 1 in 10 working age adults report feelings of loneliness, but in cities, it's nearly half of all people. What's news is the growing evidence of the role of urban design and planning in growing people's social capital, reducing loneliness and supporting mental health. What do we know? Well, we know that urban design that promotes natural, positive social interaction in the course of people's everyday lives does have the potential to help prevent mental health problems and to support recovery. Neighbourly cities can reduce depression, anxiety, dementia, even some types of psychosis. How? Well, there's big parts of the research that focus on housing design and policies, like having places to socialise in shared buildings, different models of co-housing, some really interesting models of giving college students homes in care homes, and as part of their rent, they spend a certain amount of time socialising with the older residents. And there's all sorts of benefits about people's mental health from doing that sort of thing. Then, of course, there's all the opportunities of outdoors. designing parks that specifically facilitate social interactions like chessboards or play areas or good seating or dog parks, making sure that people feel safe and comfortable enough to socialize. Location, location, location is absolutely key, because if you put a park in the middle of nowhere and you have to travel to it, you're not that likely to run into the same people over and over again. But if you put it next to people's homes or a school or a church or a market where people visit regularly, well, you'll run into the same people. You can use it as a regular meeting place, planned or impromptu. These places that you walk through regularly, you see other people, you might pause and chat to them. They're called bumping places. And it's not just parks, obviously. Another good example is a marketplace, school gates, courtyards of religious buildings, or what you can see in the photo for this section is a sitting out space in Hong Kong, little place that's set aside just off the busy street where people can sit down for a moment and chat. Another way is, of course, designing walkable neighborhoods that, as again, have lots of little shop fronts rather than a big, boring, featureless wall. Having lots of conveniences close together so that people will walk around between the shops and the post office and the library rather than driving from A to B and missing out on that neighbourly opportunity. Another important opportunity is designing places that enable volunteering, because we know that a really good way of reducing mental health problems is volunteering. The more altruistic the type of volunteering, the bigger the benefit. So, you can build opportunities like the community gardening or spaces where you can throw festivals, that sort of thing. In fact, designing urban projects can in themselves enable local people to get involved and help build up their volunteering and social capital, because they're interacting with their neighbours even as they are taking pride in contributing to neighbourhood developments. Next pillar is the active city. So this is physical activity just integrated into people's daily routines. And I mentioned that it's absolutely not just about physical health. The co-benefits for mental health are really good, whether it's benefits like increasing endorphins, helping sleep, helping cognitive function, and also getting people out and about into environments that are good for their mental health. Again, you're going to have guessed I'm talking about walkable, bikeable communities with lots of conveniences close by again. You're starting to see some trends emerging, aren't you? Park proximity to home, for example, is a really big indicator of exercise and mental health benefit. We're getting to the end of the pillars. The penultimate one is the playful city. And that's one of these areas where the research is pretty new, but it is growing fast. Play brings resilience to adverse life events. It harnesses people's curiosity. It brings people to engage in their environment in new ways that are good for their mental health. And don't make the mistake of thinking that playable cities are applicable only to children. So I've got a picture that shows the piece of art in Chicago that creates mirrors, and people are like running around taking photos of it, getting different reflections of the city in the background. That is an example of all-age playable art within the city. And then obviously opportunities for play are so vital for child and adolescent well-being. It fosters all sorts of social, cognitive, mental, emotional development. And there's a million lovely examples of designing urban play into the environment. But remember, there's designing things that are specifically for play, but then there's the opportunity of designing things that are not specifically for play, like, a piece of art is not primarily a plaything, like a climbing frame, but it still has that opportunity. So it's where can you squeeze playable elements into urban design? The last pillar, probably my favorite, is the inclusive city. So traditionally, urban planning and design professionals develop environments that are targeted towards the needs and characteristics of ethnic majority, able-bodied, working-age men. That demographic has kind of become a baseline for urban design. Cities are not that likely to be designed for young people, old people, women, disabled people, unemployed people, anyone who's part of a minority group, even though you take all these people together, and of course they are the majority of city residents. There's a really interesting story within the book, which is about a New York industrial designer called Patricia Moore. And When she was in her 20s, back in 1979, she was the only woman in a design firm of 350 staff. And she asked her senior staff about whether we could design a particular kitchen good so that it could be used with people by people with arthritis. And they were like, but we don't design for that sort of person. And she was furious about this. So she famously started what is known to be like this incredibly daring social experiment where she dressed up as a woman in her 80s. So she plugged her ears to reduce her hearing. She wore contact lenses to blur her vision. She splinted her legs and did something to like change her posture and make it harder for her to walk. And then over the next 3 years, she went out dressed like that around 116 American and Canadian cities so that she could understand the experience of going about the world as this particular type of person. And as she suspected, it didn't really go well. She couldn't get in buildings. She couldn't get around buildings. She struggled to cross the street in time. Various bad things happened to her. At one point, she was brutally attacked and left for dead. But these experiences really convinced her about the importance of inclusive design. And she's essentially considered the founder of universal design. And that is the concept that's at the heart of the inclusive city. But you know, the city experience is not just about your personal characteristics. It's interesting, in the Western Hemisphere, winds tend to blow from west to east. So in lots of cities, you'll find historically rich people live in the west side of the city, and that's where the air is cleaner. Poorer people who can't afford that are looking for more affordable accommodation, live in the cheaper, more polluted east side where the winds blow all the fumes. So, I mean, that sets up an immediate inequality in terms of exposure to air pollution, sure, but that's not all. That particular one geographical inequality leads to others because the richer people on the west side can afford more amenities. They get nicer, more plentiful parks and gyms and nice shops with lots of fresh food and convenient transport, and access to theatres and museums. Meanwhile, the people in the east were cramped together and they couldn't really afford as much. So, you know, they became disadvantaged, not just by the starting point of poor air, but then the sequence of actions and decisions that came from that. And even, you know, today in lots of cities, the West End is more expensive to live and has more amenities than the East End. So the result is that some people are missing out on the full range of the city's mental health boosting opportunities and are at more risk of exclusion and prejudice, which goes right back to affecting people's mental health. So the question is obviously, how do you build a city that doesn't favour some people's characteristics over others? And the aim of inclusive design is to make sure everyone has equitable access to environments that are good for your mental health and are not disproportionately exposed to environments that are bad for your mental health. Easier said than done. I think that the key here is engaging with the full target community, including the full diversity of current and future users of any particular place, and engaging them through all stages of inclusive planning, design, implementation, and maintenance. You might have heard this phrase used by patients in healthcare: nothing about me without me. I think that's a really good principle for the inclusive city. So, you know, when you're designing pedestrian infrastructure, remember some people have got walking frames or wheelchairs or baby buggies. Some walk slower, some might get lost, some might not be able to see the traffic light or read a certain language. When designing amenities, thinking about how to make sure people from all parts of the city can conveniently access them. Designing public transport schedules that aren't based on bringing people to offices twice a day, but enabling the movement of, for example, women who are carers, who are taking their children places, taking their older relatives places, moving around the city in a different sort of way than the current public transport systems are often designed to take you from home to work and back again. And there's all sorts of different ways, for example, of designing parks to make sure that one group doesn't take over the space and block other sets of people. This is a particular issue actually with girls and boys that has been studied really interestingly in Vienna, where teenage girls used to not go into certain parks at all, but then they redesigned it so that there were different areas and there were different entrances, so that there were now more options, and girls started using the park in a really significant way. And, you know, all these things are just so interesting because they're things that you can leverage through urban design and planning. So we're obviously getting at the end of the framework now. It's the framework for restorative cities that helps us think about cities in new ways. It's not just they need to prevent causing harm, they have this opportunity to actively help people thrive. And, you know, when you're thinking about mental health, thinking far beyond the hospitals or the doctor's surgery, this is a responsibility of urban designers and planners that they haven't really seized on as yet, but it's coming soon. And ironically, the COVID pandemic has probably helped because, you know, lots of policies that were brought in with the purpose of protecting people have had the knock-on effect of improving urban design for mental health. We've all noticed that parks are suddenly more important. There's been a surge in demand that's made city makers think about how to design in more green space. There's you know, when people are supposed to walk 2 meters apart, but they're squeezing onto a tiny sidewalk that's only 1 meter in width, then, you know, how does that compute? It used to be the case that every last inch of space that was currently taken up by cars would be fought over tooth and nail to prevent anything being pedestrianized. But, you know, during COVID, these things just happened rapidly out of necessity, and it's going to be really interesting to see what comes in the next years as a result of that. I mean, investing in public mental health is an aspect of building resilient cities, and it's just been really poorly understood. But I'm hoping that what I've told you today has helped to show you that it's a really exciting opportunity, and it's an opportunity that can't morally be ignored. There has been confusion about how to do it, but that's an old excuse. That's a 5 years ago excuse that doesn't really wash anymore. The research is growing by the day, and this new framework is hoping to make sense of it. You know, we've learned a lot about urban design for public health, and as I said, if we just go on to the last slide, there is a picture of the book Restorative Cities, which we are just writing. It's not even hot off the press yet. It's hot in the press at the moment. And I think it's going to be really important because for the past 5 years, we've had clamours from urban designers, from planners, from architects, from mayors saying, we're starting to think this is important. What should we do about it? And they want more and more and more detail. And that detail is really coming now. So it's an exciting time for this field. And I really hope that some of you will think about moving into it because there's so much opportunity here. And frankly, it's going to be part of our future. I think I'll stop there and hope you found that interesting. And I'm really happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leila. You know, you have reminded us that people need space and that cities are there for people and that they need to have the green space around them and the leisure space and the space for social interactions. And that is not buildings and buildings and buildings and levels and squeezing as many as possible into, you know, the space available. Very interesting and very, I think, thought-provoking. And I like your last point particularly. COVID has somehow changed the scene. Suddenly people walk. Suddenly people talk to each other. Yes, with a distance. Sometimes people actually smile. And so it makes a huge difference. People are out of their places and they walk around. So the floor is open for question. I'll ask Rebecca, you have been following the questions.
The first question comes from Michael, who asks, in your research, have you known someone that has looked into designing a city for neurodiversity, meaning a city that adapts and accommodates to those with autism spectrum disorder?
That is a great question. There is some research, but there's not very much. In fact, in our journal, we've published some research that has been sort of fairly basic research from undergraduates who have been really keen to expand this field and have found that there's not a ton out there. The main research that focuses on neurodiversity is really encapsulated within the Sensory City chapter of our book, which is, how the various different senses can be overwhelming for certain types of people. But I think there's a lot to look into there, and I would say there has been a little done, but not that much at all. I would strongly recommend people who are interested to do research in this field. It is very, very much needed.
Thank you. The next question comes from Teresa, and she asks, how or do mental health measures differ among people who were born and raised in a city versus those who have moved to the city? And people that have moved to the city, does a lack of place attachment and the fact that they have moved also contribute to potential mental health factors?
That's a hard question to answer because these things are kind of mixed up with each other. So first of all, say you come from somewhere that has lots of nature when you're a child, then that is a protective factor that goes all the way throughout your adulthood, even if you move to a city. However, people who move from somewhere else to a city, as I mentioned, may have done so for all sorts of reasons that create different predispositions to developing mental health problems. So even if they have that nature-based protection, they may then come to the city and experience all those different challenges that make them at more risk of mental health problems. So in summary, we don't really know. I've read lots on this and it's pretty inconclusive. It's probably the case that if you came from a rural place and you moved to the city, then you have a level of protection. But to be honest, that research is still emerging.
Thank you. And
there might have been a second part to that question, which I've now forgotten.
No, you answered it. It was all rolled into one. The next question comes from Uva, who asks, how do you assess the writings of the 1960s in a contemporary discourse and research context, especially the work of Jane Jacobs and Holly White?
Lots of that work has not really aged, I think that lots of the concepts that existed in the 60s and moving forward from there were very much pro sort of people-centered city and people-sized cities, and the garden city movement was very much a sort of before its time opportunity. I think that these people very much led the way in where we are now. And I think that where we are now is a natural evolution from the learnings that they had back several decades ago. This has not been a field that has advanced with as much speed as lots of other fields have. It felt like there was this really great groundswell in the 60s and 70s, and then it kind of went a bit quiet for a while. And then it's only really now that it's picking up again.
But I'm glad that it is picking up again. We all are. The next question comes from Jessica, one of our faculty members, and she asks, are there any cities that are currently making an explicit effort to employ urban design for mental health? For example, Washington, D.C. is doing a lot along the lines of what you have described, but is that planning actually focused on mental health?
Oh, another great question. So lots of cities do things that by chance also are good for mental health, but they've not explicitly chosen to do those things because of the mental health benefits. And it's actually quite interesting. At the Centre for Urban Design and Mental Health, we have a city case study project where people go and interview experts within their city and look at all the guidance and assess the extent to which those city approaches are good for your mental health, even if they didn't design it specifically for that purpose. And that's been looking at the Mind the Gaps framework. So whether there's green space, nobody's explicitly said this is for your mental health, but nevertheless is beneficial and active for social and safe spaces, of course. And it shows that every city, to some extent, puts these elements into parts of their design. But it's not that common until very recently, until the last couple of years probably, it's not been that common that they will explicitly say that that's why they're doing it. If you look at a city like Barcelona, they've got a really interesting model that they're developing at the moment, which they have said that mental health is part of the reason why they're doing it. They call it super blocks. So if you think of a city being laid out on a grid, then what they've done is they've mostly pedestrianized lots of the cities within us. So if there's like a square with lots of roads going up and down it in a grid, they've pedestrianized all those roads and only have the main roads around the perimeter being for cars. And the purpose of doing that is to try to increase neighborliness, activity, green space within the proximity to people's homes and local amenities. And this has really been seen as a bit of a revolutionary approach by lots of other cities who can't countenance the concept of taking cars off the roads. Barcelona has all sorts of exciting plans for really enhancing their public transport so that people wouldn't even want to drive into the city. And things like that are explicitly looking at mental health. But then, when we do city case studies in some cities, for example, in Asia or in Africa, sometimes the concept of mental health is less well recognized. And as such, they might conceive it in different ways, but often it is the same sort of concept. It's just people have lacked the terminology to be really clear about what they're doing and why. But in many cases, they are still using lots of the principles. If you think about the principles of an age-friendly city or the principles of a child-friendly city, actually those things have a lot in common with a mentally healthy city for all age groups.
I take the next question because I've often asked myself something similar. John has asked, to what extent do you need to be engaged with the natural green environment to get mental health benefit? Or specifically, should you turn off your phone and remove the earbuds? Or do you get benefits from just being present in a green environment? In other words, if one walks around, I think 50 or 60% of the fellow human beings which one meets have the earbuds in. They're listening to something. Do they see the nature? So what, can you tell us a little bit from the psychiatrist view what makes sense, what one should do?
It's a bit of $1 million question, Professor Lisa, because what we're really thinking about here is, as I mentioned in my talk, the dose. Everybody's like, what is the dose of of greenery that will improve your mental health? Is it looking at it? Is it being in it? Is it experiencing it in a particular way? I mean, honestly, we don't know the answer to that. What an interesting thing to look at is the Japanese practice of Shinrin-yoku, which is essentially translated as forest bathing. In Japan, this is a big deal. This is the sort of thing that your work will pay for you to go and do as a health and well-being intervention. And the concept is that you're in a forest that you're experiencing with all 5 of your senses at once. And there's been various physiological research done showing things like reduced levels of stress hormones and reduced blood pressure and things like that. So there's this concept of this being the gold standard. It's hard to know whether that's absolutely true, but I think that in general it's accepted that immersion in nature without danger, without the fear of danger, like, your mental health is knocked off a bit if you think you're about to be mugged or bitten by a snake. But in general, immersion is considered to be a gold standard, but then just being in it, like walking through a park would be, like a level down from that. Walking alongside a park would be a level down from that. And then there's research that tells us that looking out of a window has mental health benefits. If you're looking at green space versus grey space. There's not been a lot of randomized controlled trials of this, but there's been a really interesting one published in JAMA a couple of years ago, which looked at walking past old sort of parking lots that had been greened versus old parking lots that had just been like tidied up. And the impact on mental health over time for the green ones was really significantly different. So it's very likely that there is a dose response curve, but nobody so far really has been able to narrow it down. I think that it's also really worth noting that there is a big impact on maintenance. Having green spaces that are well kept are more beneficial. And it's also worth noting that most of this research has been done in the West. And actually, if you look at some of the countries that are not predisposed to having lots of parks and things, then it might be a different story. I did a little bit of research in Mongolia, and actually the research there showed us that green space was not particularly improving people's mental health. So that brings in an interesting question about what is the connotation of green space in a particular culture, and does that affect your mental health as well?
Let me take the next question as well, because it's something which has to do with urban inequality. We all know, and the question is from Angela. We all know that in the poorer parts of the city, there are no dog parks, there are very few green spaces, etc. And I know from my personal experience working in Australia in an area with Aboriginals that the gentrification drives the Aboriginals to the periphery. They basically are driven out of the city. And so the question is, what can we do in this area? How do you see, what kind of opportunities, possibilities do you see to really steer the ship into a different direction?
Yeah. It's a really challenging issue, and we do deal with that in the book, in the Inclusive City chapter. And obviously, I don't have all the answers to that, but it's very clear that gentrification has had all sorts of horrible effects on people who originally lived in certain places and then have felt themselves forced out economically, psychologically. And from the research, which of course doesn't have all the answers either, it seems to be a case of adding to rather than taking over as being the aspiration. It's not the case that you can't, have some new development, but when it starts to completely take over, then that's where the problems really start. The research tells us that having people living in mixed environments is probably the best thing for our mental health. So people who are diverse in socioeconomic status, diverse in race or ethnicity, diverse in sexuality, all of those people coming together in a sort of melting pot who all get to access amenities that are meaningful to them, and who get to see their identities reflected. So for example, in street names or street art, that makes people feel like they belong to a place, even though there may be other types of people also in that place. If everybody is able to see and experience belongingness, then the research seems to be telling us that that is probably the direction that we need to be facing. And that includes, when developments are happening, including all sorts of people who are going to be experiencing that space going forward, and not just like giving them a survey, but really properly engaging them and helping them get involved in co-design of that place, and maybe even maintenance of that place for the future, so that people have a sense of ownership, a sense of belongingness, and a sense of pride.
I'm just mindful of the time, of everyone's time, but of yours in particular, that it's you're 5 hours ahead of us. But I would like to ask another question that comes from Patrick, but it was also something that I was wondering, is there a conflict between the concepts that you have described and go into your book and abstract modernist architectural building design with pyramids of glass and steel? Is there a conflict there? Do they contribute to mental health factors, good or bad?
Well, when I think about urban design and planning, I don't look at individual buildings so much as the public sphere. I don't think that there is inherently a conflict, because there would be a conflict if every single building looked exactly the same and had a monotonous facade, so that when you walk down the street, all you ever saw was like a big block of concrete. But that's not really where we are at the moment. There's a diversity in design that the research tells us is good for us in terms of stimulating our senses and keeping us interested. There clearly are some buildings that work better than other buildings. If you're super interested, you might want to pop onto our website, where there's a really interesting talk in our Tokyo event from the people who designed the new Coca-Cola Tokyo headquarters. And they really designed it with mental well-being in mind. And they've done, while it is like a big blocky design, in some ways, actually they've done some really cool and interesting things to try to make it good for mental well-being. And I think that that's maybe where we need to be heading, looking at how do we adapt those designs, whatever they may look like, to incorporate greenery, to incorporate pro-social interaction, and all those other things that I described that are good for mental health. It doesn't have to be an either or situation, but I think that increasingly architects and designers are they've always looked at things in terms of what the human experience is. It just means that they've now got more information about how to affect that human experience. And I think we can probably see some of that coming into the work over time. Really, the limiting factor is whether there's demand for it. There hasn't been tons of demand for it because of a lack of knowledge. But now that this is becoming more of a mainstreamed concept, actually, we're hearing more and more from architects that they're being asked to incorporate this sort of thinking into their design.
And I put the website for the Center for Urban Design and Mental Health in the chat if anyone would like to go visit it.
Leila, I think we have to come to the last question, not to take too much of your time, but I think this is one about almost predicting the future. It's from Sergio. What about the economic constraints that always seem to play against implementing sustainability plans? And the question is really, do you think that after COVID, this framework would change, as in prioritizing equity and environment first, and then figuring out the economics? I think it's an unfair question, but nevertheless, I like to hear the answer.
I'd say that the economic constraints is one of the big reasons that this hasn't really taken off until now. I spent quite a lot of time in Hong Kong at the Asia Global Institute as a fellow recently. And, I spoke to lots of architects and planners, and they said, every single square inch is worth X amount of money. I can't afford to give it over to something that's going to be good for mental health if it doesn't bring in extra profit. So the concept of that is that how do we socialize this concept of designing for mental health so that it actually is more valued and does bring in that extra profit? I think that here is another call for an area where more research is needed, which is how do we best define the economic impact of mental health problems, and how can we quantify the economic benefits of different types of investments in pro-mental health design. It's an exciting frontier that is going to have to be cracked in order to make meaningful movement, because you're right, at the end of the day, money talks, and in constrained times, even more so. But I also do think that COVID has brought a lens of public health and a lens of recognizing impacts of the environment on mental health to the whole world. And that is also going to play into this, hopefully in a positive way.
Yes, thank you, Leila. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and for really a thought-provoking presentation. It needs activists like you to move the agenda ahead, to put the needle out there. The issues are serious, I think. They're not well researched, and we tend to conveniently forget about it often. So I think it is very important that we keep them on the agenda. Again, once more, thank you so much. And as always, I give the parole, the last word to Rebecca.
Well, then I'll ask Leila to give her final last word. But I think what's really positive is just seeing how many people have turned up to hear you talk and how engaging all of the questions have been. And that makes me really excited that there's an appetite to look at cities in this light, to look at mental health in this light. And I think that that's really positive to hopefully build momentum forward. And that's all with your work and what you've been able to share and to build that knowledge bank that previously didn't exist. So thank you for sharing all of that with us today. And I think there will be some people on here that will buy your book alongside Harry Potter.
I feel like it's a bit early to be promoting it since it's not officially published until August. But I do hope that you enjoy it. And I also hope that if you're interested in researching in this field, you'll get in touch and send things over to the journal, because, you know, there's actually so few people doing good research in this that you can get quite far if this is an area that interests you. So do bear it in mind. And the Journal of Urban Design and Mental Health awaits your paper.